In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling note appears in the church alms box. I hear all, and I judge. Whispers spread of the listener, a shadow who knows every secret, lurking in the dark. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet knitting, senses danger as scandal erupts. Miss Grey flees, the vicar trembles, and Dr. Haydock hides a shameful past. As the listener's web tightens, Miss Marple sets a cunning trap, uncovering a trail of cigarette ash and betrayal that points to an unlikely villain. But who is pulling the strings, and what final secret waits in the shadows, ready to unravel the village's heart? Only Miss Marple can find the truth before it's too late. Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Village Inn, the drowsy heart of St. Mary Mead, where the lanes wound lazily between hedgerows and the church spire stood as sentinel over thatched roofs. Life moved with the predictable rhythm of a well-wound clock. Yet, on this particular October morning, a faint discord had crept into the village's harmony, like a missed note in a familiar tune. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her chin-skirted drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking with the precision of a metronome, sensed it as keenly as a fox sensed the wind. The room was warm, the fire crackling softly, and the air carried the delicate fragrance of lavender from a bowl on the sideboard. Miss Marple's hands, delicate yet steady, worked a pale blue wool into the beginnings of a shawl, but her eyes sharp behind their spectacles were alert to the world beyond her. Window. The village, she knew, was a tapestry of small secrets, each thread a whispered confidence or a sidelong glance. She had long ago learned to read its patterns, to see the shadows cast by unspoken truths. The discord had begun with a visit from Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who had bustled into Miss Marple's cottage an hour earlier, her cheeks flushed with more than the autumn chill. Over tea and scones, Mrs. Price had spoken of a peculiar discovery in the church alms box, a folded slip of paper tucked among the coins, bearing a single sentence in a neat, unfamiliar hand. I hear all, and I judge. The words, stark and ominous, had unsettled her. It's not the sort of thing one expects in St. Mary Mead, she had said, her voice trembling slightly. It feels sinister, don't you think, Miss Marple? Miss Marple had murmured sympathetically, her needles never pausing. But her mind had seized upon the note like a cat upon a mouse. Sinister, yes, but also deliberate. Someone had placed it there, knowing it would be found, knowing it would ripple through the village like a stone in a pond. She had asked, with her usual air of mild curiosity, whether anything else unusual had occurred at the vicarage. Mrs. Price, after a moment's thought, mentioned a stranger seen loitering near the churchyard 2 evenings prior, figure in a dark coat, too distant to identify, who had vanished when approached. The village, Miss Marple reflected, was no stranger to gossip. Mrs. Price's tale of the note had already spread, taking on a life of its own. At the post office, Miss Hartnell had declared it the work of a prankster, while Mr. Redding, the butcher, muttered darkly about someone poking their nose where it don't belong. By noon, the note had acquired a name, the work of the listener, a shadowy figure who, according to the villagers' fertile imagination, lurked in doorways and behind hedges, collecting secrets like a magpie hoards trinkets. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle fancy. She knew that secrets, when weaponized, could cut deeper than any knife. As she sipped her tea, her gaze drifted to the garden where her maid, Cherry, was pegging out washing. Cherry, with her quick tongue and quicker ears, was a fount of village news. Miss Marple called her in, offering a slice of seed cake as bait. "Cherry," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "have you heard this talk of the—" Listener, Cherry, never one to resist a gossip, nodded vigorously. She spoke of whispers at the Blue Boar, where the barmaid swore she'd overheard a stranger asking about the comings and goings of Netherby Hall's guests. "Not a local," Miss Cherry said, her eyes wide. He had a sharp way of talking, like he was weighing every word. Miss Marple nodded, her face serene but her mind racing. Netherby Hall, home to her old friends, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, was the village's grandest residence, a magnet for intrigue. The Bantrys were hosting a dinner party that evening, and Miss Marple invited, as a gesture of kindness, to an aging spinster, knew it would be a chance to observe. The listener, she suspected, was no phantom but a flesh and blood presence, someone who moved among them, unnoticed yet all-seeing. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of London blackmailers, who thrived on the secrets of the careless. Could such a creature have found their way to St. Mary Mead? As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and donned her best black silk, preparing for the evening at Netherby Hall. She glanced at the mirror, her reflection showing a frail white-haired lady who seemed as harmless as a dormouse. But beneath that unassuming exterior burned a mind as sharp as a needle, ready to unpick the mystery of the listener. The village might whisper, but Miss Marple listened on. She understood. Chapter 2. The shadow at the manor. The dining room of Netherby Hall glowed with the soft light of candelabra, their flames dancing on the polished mahogany table. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, genial hosts of St. Mary Mead's grandest estate, presided over a gathering that buzzed with the polite chatter of a small but carefully chosen company. The guests, seated beneath the stern gazes of ancestral portraits, included Dr. Haydock, the village's young physician with a reputation for charm, Miss Lavinia Gray, whose beauty and flirtations were the talk of the county, Mr. Pym, a reclusive scholar with ink-stained fingers, and Miss Jane Marple, whose presence was a quiet nod to old friendships, her unassuming figure almost lost amid the sparkle of crystal and silver. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observed the scene with the keenness of a hawk. The conversation, at first, was all harvest festivals and the price of coal, but it soon veered, as she knew it would, to the village's newest obsession. The listener, Mrs. Bantwidge, her cheeks flushed from a glass of claret, recounted the tale of the cryptic note found in the church alms box, her voice carrying a theatrical shiver. "Imagine," she said, leaning forward, "someone lurking, hearing our every word. It's positively gothic." The table responded with a mix of amusement and unease. Dr. Haydock laughed, dismissing it as village nonsense, though his eyes flicked briefly to the shadowed corners of the room. Mr. Pym, adjusting his spectacles, murmured something about the folly of secrets in small communities, his tone dry but his fingers tightening on his fork. Miss Gray, however, grew pale, her laughter brittle as she toyed with the pearls at her throat. Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hand, the way her gaze darted to the tall windows, where the night pressed close against the panes. The talk shifted to safer topics, Mrs. Bantry's roses, the Colonel's new hunter, but attention lingered on Miss Gray. The young woman's vivacity seemed forced, her smiles too quick to fade. She was, Miss Marple recalled, a newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having arrived 6 months prior with a vague story of London connections and a modest inheritance. Her charm had won her invitations to every drawing room, but whispers of indiscreet letters and late-night visitors followed her like a shadow. Could the listener have caught wind of something Miss Grey wished hidden? After dinner, as the party moved to the drawing room for coffee, Miss Marple excused herself to the terrace, claiming a need for air. The night was crisp, the garden a maze of silhouettes under a sliver of moon. She walked slowly, her shawl drawn tight, her steps silent on the flagstones. The murmur of voices from the open windows carried to her Mrs. Bantry's laugh, the Colonel's hearty anecdotes, but another sound pricked her ears. A faint rustle in the laurel bushes, like the whisper of fabric against leaves. She paused, her heart steady, her senses sharp. Someone was there, hidden in the dark, close enough to hear the drawing room's secrets. She did not call out. Instead, she returned to the house, her face serene but her mind alight. Inside, she found Miss Grey by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the flames. Miss Marple approached, offering a gentle smile. "The night is chilly, my dear," she said, "but the gardens are lovely. Did you walk out earlier?" Miss Grey started, her cheeks flushing. "No, I stayed inside," she stammered, her voice betraying a lie so thin it might have torn under scrutiny. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but stored the moment. Away, a single stitch in the pattern she was beginning to weave. As the evening drew to a close, the guests departed, their laughter fading into the night. Miss Marple, driven home by the Bantry's chauffeur, sat quietly in the back of the Rolls-Royce, her thoughts circling the rustle in the bushes and Miss Grey's unease. The listener, she was certain, had been at Netherby Hall that night, not as a guest, but as a shadow, watching, waiting. She thought of her old friend Lady Conway, who had once been undone by a servant who overheard too much. Servants, villagers, strangers, anyone could listen, but only one would wield that knowledge like a blade. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, turned to the darkened lanes of St. Mary Mead, where secrets waited to be unravelled. Chapter 3. The First Confession. The morning sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, gilding the cobblestones and waking the sparrows in the hedgerows. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting a soft rhythm against the quiet as she turned the pages of the morning's post. The village, however, was far from tranquil. By mid-morning, a scandal had erupted, spreading like wildfire through the tea-rooms and shop counters. Miss Lavinia Grey had fled St. Mary Mead in the dead of night, leaving behind a confession that set tongues wagging. The news reached Miss Marple via Cherry, her maid, who burst into the drawing room with a tray of tea and a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "It's all anyone's talking about, miss," Cherry said, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Miss Grey's gone packed a bag and took the late train to London." Her maid, Jenny, found a letter on the dressing table, confessing she'd been carrying on with a married man. The whole village knows by now. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A letter, you say? How very public for such a private matter." She sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the details. Miss Grey, with her polished manners and careful charm, had seemed too cautious to expose herself so recklessly. A confession, left where a maid was certain to find it, felt staged, like a scene from one of Raymond's theatrical novels. She decided to visit Miss Grey's cottage, a neat little house on the edge of the village, its roses still blooming defiantly despite the autumn chill. Jenny, the maid, was there, red-eyed and flustered, tidying the deserted rooms. Miss Marple, with her air of gentle curiosity, coaxed the girl into talking. "The letter," Jenny said, was written in Miss Grey's hand, but oddly stiff, as if copied from a draft. It wasn't like her, Miss Marple, Jenny whispered. She was so particular about her reputation. Why write it down for all to see? Miss Marple wandered the sitting room, her eyes taking in the details. A vase of wilting flowers, a faint trace of lavender perfume, and, curiously, the acrid whiff of cigarette smoke. Miss Grey, she knew, did not smoke. Stooping as if to adjust her shawl, she peered into the wastebasket and found a torn scrap of paper, its edge singed. The words, in a different hand from the alms box note, read, "You were heard." She slipped it into her pocket, her face betraying nothing. At the vicarage, over a second cup of tea, Mrs. Price confirmed the village's shock. "It's dreadful," she said, wringing her hands. Miss Grey was flighty perhaps, but to leave like this. And that letter, it's as if she wanted to be ruined. Miss Marple listened, her expression mild, but her thoughts turned to the dinner at Netherby Hall, Miss Grey's unease, the rustle in the bush head. Someone overheard a secret and forced her hand. The listener, it seemed, was not content to merely hear, but to act. Driving their prey into the open, she recalled a similar case from her youth, when a governess in her village had been hounded by anonymous letters until she fled in disgrace. The culprit then had been a jealous rival, but here the motive was murkier. Blackmail, perhaps, or something more malicious. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, each stitch a step closer to clarity. The listener had struck their first blow, but Miss Grey's flight was only the beginning. The village, she knew, held more secrets, and the one who listened was still out there, hidden in plain sight. Chapter 4. The Vicar's Burden. The vicarage of St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-clad walls and sagging gate, stood as a quiet haven amidst the village's growing unease. Inside, the Reverend Leonard Clement sat in his study, his usually serene face clouded with worry. Miss Jane Marple, invited for tea under the pretense of discussing the church fate, noted the strain in his eyes as he poured from a chipped teapot. The room was cozy, with bookshelves groaning under theological tomes, but an air of disquiet hung as heavily as the scent of old leather and wax polish. Mrs. Price, bustling about with scones, had hinted to Miss Marple that her husband was troubled. And now, with the door closed and the fire crackling, the vicar unburdened himself. "I received another of those wretched notes," he confessed, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might overhear. He produced a slip of paper from his desk, its edges creased from anxious handling. The message, in the same neat hand as the alms box note, read, "Your silence betrays you." The words were vague, yet piercing, like a dart aimed at the heart of his conscience. Miss Marple, her knitting resting in her lap, leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft but searching. "How distressing, Mr. Clement," she murmured. "Have you any notion what it refers to?" The vicar shook his head, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup. "I've racked my mind, Miss Marple. I'm a simple man, not without flaws, but I know of no sin so grave as to warrant this." His voice faltered, betraying a fear that the note's author knew something he did not dared not admit. She asked, with the gentle persistence of a breeze wearing down stone, "About recent visitors to the vicarage. Mr. Clement mentioned Mr. Pym, the scholar, who had come seeking counsel 2 days prior. He was vague," the vicar said, frowning. "Spoke of personal troubles, a burden of knowledge, but wouldn't elaborate. He seemed watchful, as if weighing my words." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Mr. Pym's presence at Netherby Hall, his tense demeanor. when the listener was mentioned, now took on a sharper edge. The vicar's distress reminded her of a long-ago incident in her youth, when a curate in her father's parish had been tormented by anonymous accusations, driven to despair by their relentless ambiguity. The culprit then had been a spurned parishioner, but here the stakes felt higher, the intent colder. Was the listener targeting the vicar to unsettle the village's moral core, or was there a personal grudge at play? As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the churchyard lay quiet under a grey sky. She thought of the note's phrasing, "Your silence betrays you," and its calculated vagueness. It was designed to provoke guilt, to make the vicar question himself. Whoever wrote it knew the power of suggestion, the way a single phrase could unravel a man's peace. She recalled Mr. Pym's solitary walks through the village, his habit of lingering near open windows or crowded tea rooms. Could he be the listener, collecting fragments of lives for some obscure purpose? Yet his scholarly air seemed at odds with such calculated cruelty, thanking the vicar for his hospitality. Miss Marple stepped into the chilly afternoon, her shawl drawn tight. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, children playing, the clatter of a milk cart, but beneath it lay a current of fear. The listener's notes were no idle prank. They were a net tightening round St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's steps were slow, her figure frail, but her mind was a steel trap, closing on the truth, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Dilemma. The Blue Boar, St. Mary Mead's only inn, was a hub of village life. Its low-beamed ceilings and smoky air thick with the murmur of locals. On this damp evening, the firelight cast flickering shadows as Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the clink of pint glasses. She had come, ostensibly, to enjoy a quiet sherry, but her true purpose was to observe and to listen. The village was still reeling from Miss Grey's abrupt departure, and the spectre of the listener hung over every conversation like a storm cloud. Dr. Haydock, the village's young physician, sat at the bar, his usual charm dimmed by a slump. In his shoulders and a glass of whiskey he nursed with uncharacteristic intensity. Miss Marple, her eyes half hidden behind her spectacles, noted the lines of strain on his face, the way his fingers drummed restlessly. She had known him since he arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 years ago, a capable doctor with a ready smile. Yet tonight he seemed a man under siege, approaching him with the air of a kindly aunt. She remarked on the chill of the evening, drawing him into conversation. The whiskey loosened his tongue, and after a moment's hesitation, he confided in her, his voice low and ragged. "I've had a letter, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes darting to the inn's door. "It threatens to expose a mistake I made. Years ago, a medical error, harmless in the end, but it could ruin me if it got out." He admitted to paying a sum to an anonymous account, slipped into a postbox as instructed, but another note had arrived, demanding more. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her face a mask of gentle concern. "How dreadful," she murmured. "Have you any idea who might know of this mistake?" Dr. Haydock shook his head, his expression haunted. "It was buried in old records from my first year practicing. Only someone with access to my files could have found it." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Elsie, Mrs. Bantry's maid, was in my office last week, asking about my filing system. Said she was curious about medical work. Seemed odd at the time." The mention of Elsie sharpened Miss Marple's focus. The maid, with her quiet demeanor and access to Netherby Hawes' secrets, was ideally placed to overhear private matters. Miss Marple recalled Elsie's presence at the dinner party, moving silently among the guests, her eyes downcast but her ears, no doubt, open. Could she be the listener's instrument, witting or not? Or was she merely a link in a chain Miss Marple had yet to fully trace? She thought of a case her nephew Dermot had once described, where a hospital clerk had blackmailed patients by rifling through confidential files. The method here was similar, but the listener's reach felt broader, their intent more insidious. Dr. Haydock's haggard look, the tremor in his hands, spoke of a man trapped in a tightening noose. The listener was not merely collecting secrets, but wielding them with precision, striking at the village's pillars, its beauty, its vicar, its healer. As she finished her sherry, Miss Marple offered Dr. Haydock a reassuring smile. "These things have a way of coming to light," she said softly, her words carrying a weight he did not yet grasp. She stepped into the night, the inn's warmth fading behind her. The village lay quiet, its lamplights glowing like beacons in the fog. But Miss Marple felt the listener's presence, a shadow moving just beyond sight. Elsie's curiosity, the cigarette ash at Miss Grey's cottage, Mr. Pym's watchful air, these were threads in a web, and she was determined to find its center. Chapter 6. The maid's tale. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. In her drawing room, the air was fragrant with the scent of freshly baked scones, a calculated lure for Elsie, Mrs. Bantry's young maid, who now sat perched on the edge of a chintz-covered chair. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking like a gentle metronome, offered a warm smile and poured tea from a silver pot, her demeanor as disarming as a summer breeze. Yet her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, missed nothing: the nervous twitch of Elsie's fingers, the way her gaze darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. The pretext for the visit was a discussion of the village charity bazaar, but Miss Marple deftly steered the conversation to the recent upheavals in St. Mary Mead. "Such a pity about Miss Grey," she remarked, her tone soft with sympathy, "and poor Dr. Haydock, looking so worn. The village is quite unsettled, don't you think, Elsie?" The maid nodded, her cheeks flushing, and sipped her tea with a haste that betrayed unease. With the patience of one accustomed to unraveling tangled skeins, Miss Marple probed gently. "You must hear all sorts of things at Netherby Hall, my dear. Servants always do, though they're so discreet." The compliment, delivered with a twinkle, loosened Elsie's tongue. She admitted to overhearing Miss Grey's late-night telephone calls while polishing silver in the hall. Conversations laced with whispers of a secret lover. "I didn't mean to listen, miss," Elsie said, her voice trembling. "It just carried through the walls. I never told a soul, I swear." Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of kindly understanding, but her mind seized on Elsie's words. The maid's access to Netherby Hall's private corners made her a perfect conduit for gossip, intentional or not. She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of Elsie's curiosity about his files, and now this admission of eavesdropping. Yet Elsie's earnestness seemed genuine, her eyes wide with fear rather than guile. Miss Marple's gaze fell to the girl's new brooch, a delicate silver piece studded with a small garnet pinned proudly to her blouse. "What a lovely brooch, Elsie," she said. "A gift, I presume?" Elsie's flush deepened. "From my cousin in London," she stammered, her fingers brushing the ornament. "Sent it last month." Miss Marple's smile did not waver, but she noted the lie. A maid's wages could not afford such finery, and Elsie's cousins, as Cherry had once mentioned, were farm labourers with little to spare. Was the brooch a reward for services rendered, perhaps to the listener? As Elsie left, clutching a parcel of scones, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resuming its rhythm. She thought of a housemaid from her childhood, bribed with trinkets to carry tales to a vindictive neighbor. Elsie, she suspected, was no mastermind but a pawn, her ears unwittingly feeding a sharper mind. The brooch, the overheard calls, the cigarette ash at Miss Grey's cottage, these were fragments of a puzzle, each edged with menace. The listener was weaving a net around St. Mary Mead, and Elsie, whether she knew it or not, was caught in its threads. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her thoughts racing toward the shadow at the heart of the web. Chapter 7. The scholar's secret. The lane to Mr. Pym's cottage wound through St. Mary Mead like a ribbon, bordered by hawthorn hedges and the last stubborn blooms of autumn. Miss Jane Marple, her black umbrella shielding her from a light drizzle, approached the scholar's modest home with the air of a neighbor on a simple errand. In her basket, a book on local history, borrowed from Mrs. Bantry, served as her excuse. But her true purpose was to probe the reclusive Mr. Pym, whose watchful demeanor and cryptic remarks at Netherby Hall had lingered in her mind like an unresolved chord. The cottage door creaked open, revealing Mr. Pym, his thin frame stooped and his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but guarded, an unexpected pleasure. He ushered her into a parlor cluttered with books and papers, the air heavy with the musty scent of old ink. A single chair, cleared of manuscripts, was offered, and she sat, her knitting tucked away but her senses alert. The room felt like a lair, its chaos a deliberate shield for secrets. She began with pleasantries, mentioning the book and the village's recent troubles. "This talk of the listener," she said, her tone light, "it does unsettle one, doesn't it? So many secrets brought to light." Mr. Pym's fingers, stained with ink, twitched slightly, and his eyes flicked to a desk where papers spilled like fallen leaves. "People talk too much," he muttered. "Secrets are merely truths waiting to be found." His words, delivered with a scholar's detachment, carried an edge that sharpened Miss Marple's attention. Feigning distraction, she leaned forward to admire a brass paperweight, her glance catching a scrap of paper half hidden under a blotter. The words, scrawled in a precise hand, read, "The truth lies in what is unsaid." It was not the listener's script, but its cryptic tone echoed the notes that had plagued the village. She made no comment, instead asking about his research into St. Mary Mead's history. Mr. Pym spoke of parish records and forgotten scandals, but his voice grew strained, his gaze avoiding hers when she mentioned the vicar's distress. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's foot brushed the doorstep, where a faint scatter of cigarette ash caught her eye, the same acrid scent she'd noted at Miss Grey's cottage. Mr. Pym, she knew, did not smoke. Someone else had been here, perhaps watching, perhaps listening. She thanked him warmly, her smile as soft as ever. But her mind was a whirl of connections. Mr. Pym's solitary habits, his presence at the vicarage, his cryptic note, were they the work of the listener, or was he, too, a victim of their gaze? Walking back through the drizzle, Miss Marple recalled a librarian from her youth, whose obsession with village gossip had masked a deeper vendetta. Mr. Pym's scholarly veneer might hide a similar motive, or he might be a pawn, his research a tool for another's malice. The ash, Elsie's brooch, Dr. Haydock's blackmouther, threads were converging, and Miss Marple felt the pattern nearing completion. The listener was close, their shadow lengthening over St. Mary Mead, but she was closer still, her quiet steps tracing the edges of their web. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The twilight draped St. Mary Mead in a hush, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles idle for once, her mind weaving a plan as intricate as the lace shawl in her lap. The listener's shadow had grown darker with each passing day, their notes sowing discord among the village's pillars. Miss Gray's flight, the vicar's unease, Dr. Haydock's torment, the cigarette ash at Mr. Pym's cottage, Elsie's costly brooch. These were clues, but Miss Marple needed more than threads. She needed to catch the weaver. She devised a trap, subtle yet deliberate, as was her way. Over tea with Mrs. Bantry at Netherby Hall, she let slip a fabricated secret, her voice just loud enough for Elsie, polishing silver nearby, to overhear. "I've found an old will in my attic," she said, her tone conspiratorial, hidden in a tea caddy, of all places. It could change everything for someone in the village. Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the intrigue, played along, her eyes sparkling, unaware of the bait being laid. Miss Marple watched Elsie's shadow pause in the doorway, her head tilted as if drinking in the words. That evening, Miss Marple left her cottage windows dark, her curtains parted just enough to tempt a watcher. She sat in her armchair, a silhouette, against the faint glow of a single lamp, her knitting a pretext as she listened to the night. The village was still, but her senses were sharp, tuned to the smallest disturbance. At 10:30, a soft creak sounded from her garden gate, followed by the cautious tread of footsteps on the gravel path. A shadow moved beyond the window, a fleeting shape against the moonlit shrubs, too careful to be a casual passerby. She did not stir. To confront the intruder now would be premature. The listener thrived on secrecy, and she meant to draw them into the open. Instead, she rose the next morning and walked to the church, where she slipped a note into the alms box, its message simple but pointed. "I know who listens." It was a challenge, a tug on the web to see who flinched. She returned home, her face serene, but her heart quickened with anticipation. The listener, she knew, would not resist such a lure as she sat by her fire that afternoon. Miss Marple recalled a poacher from her childhood, caught not by chasing him, but by baiting a trap with what he could not resist. The listener, too, was driven by a hunger for secrets, for control, and her note was the bait. She thought of Mr. Pym's cryptic paper, Elsie's nervous glances, the ash that tied disparate scenes. The net was tightening, and she felt the tremor of its strands. The listener was close, their next move inevitable, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was ready to meet it. Chapter 9. The confrontation. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, veiling the village in a gauzy shroud that muffled footsteps and sharpened whispers. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn against the damp, sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched. As she awaited the ripple, her trap would stir. The note she had placed in the church alms box, "I know who listens," was a calculated prod, designed to unsettle the listener and force a misstep. By noon, her patience was rewarded when Mr. Pym appeared at her door, his face pale and his spectacles slipping down his nose, betraying a man on the edge of unraveling. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight as he stood in her drawing room. Refusing the offered chair, "I must speak plainly. Those notes, the ones they call the listeners, I wrote them." His confession spilled out in a rush, as if the words had been bottled too long. He claimed his intent was not malice, but a misguided attempt to expose the villagers' hypocrisies. inspired by his research into its hidden histories. "I overheard things," he said, "in the church, at the inn, fragments of lives. I thought to nudge people toward truth." Miss Marple's eyes, soft but piercing, studied him. His hands trembled, and his gaze flickered to the window, as if expecting pursuit. She recalled the cigarette ash on his doorstep, the scent that matched the trace at Miss Gray's cottage, and the ash, Mr. Pym. She asked gently, "You don't smoke, do you?" His face crumpled, and he stammered, I don't know how it got there. Someone's been watching me, too." His words faltered, and before she could press further, he muttered an excuse and fled, his coat flapping as he hurried down the lane. Miss Marple did not follow at once. Instead, she sipped her tea, her mind sifting through his confession. Mr. Pym's admission explained the note's scholarly tone, but not the blackmail that had driven Dr. Haydock to despair or Miss Gray to flight. His fear suggested he was a tool, not the mastermind. She recalled a village busybody from her youth, whose gossip had been twisted by another to ruin a rival. Was Pym's zeal being exploited by a sharper mind? Acting on instinct, she donned her hat and walked to Netherby Hall, where the gardens lay quiet under the mist. As she neared the laurel walk, she heard raised voices, Elsie's, high and defensive, and Mr. Pym's, sharp with accusation. Hiding behind a yew hedge, Miss Marple listened. "You told me it was harmless," Elsie was saying, her voice breaking. "Just passing on bits I heard, for a bit of extra money." Pym's reply was bitter. "You fed me scraps, and now I'm caught in this mess." Their argument confirmed Elsie's role as an unwitting informant. But the brooch, the blackmail, the ash, someone else was pulling the strings. Miss Marple retreated, her steps silent on the damp grass. The confrontation had revealed much, but the true listener remained in the shadows. Their web tightening around Pym and Elsie, she thought of the cigarette ash, a clue that pointed to neither scholar nor maid. The trap had worked, but the quarry was still at large, and Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully to draw them into the light. Chapter 10. The True Listener. The fog had lifted from St. Mary Mead, leaving the village bathed in a crisp autumn light that sharpened every detail, the glint of dew on the grass, the curl of smoke from cottage chimneys. Miss Jane Marple sat in her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm, but her mind was far from idle. Mr. Pym's confession and his heated exchange with Elsie had unraveled part of the listener's web, but the mastermind remained elusive. The cigarette ash, Elsie's garnet brooch, the precise cruelty of the blackmail. These pointed to a cunning far beyond the scholar's moralizing or the maid's gossip. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a figure she had nearly overlooked. Mr. Thorne, the new gardener at Netherby Hall. He was a man of few words, his weathered face and calloused hands suggesting a life of hard work, yet his presence was unobtrusive, almost invisible, as he trimmed hedges or raked leaves near open windows. Cherry had mentioned his habit of lingering near the hall's terraces, always with a cigarette dangling from his lips, a distinctive Turkish brand, its sharp scent matching the ash at Miss Gray's cottage and Mr. Pym's doorstep, she recalled. A conversation with her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, who had once described a petty criminal who used menial roles to gather secrets for profit. Acting on a hunch, Miss Marple telephoned Dermot, her voice calm but urgent, asking him to inquire about Thorne's past. The response came swiftly. Thorne, alias Thomas Reed, had a history of extortion, using overheard confidences to fleece his employers before vanishing. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead under a false name, his references forged. The pieces fell into place. Thorne had manipulated Mr. Pym's notes, turning his vague accusations into targeted blackmail. Elsie's gossip, gathered from her work at Netherby Hall, had been the raw material, fed to Pym under the guise of scholarly interest, then twisted by Thorne into demands for payment. The brooch was no cousin's gift, but a bribe to keep Elsie compliant. Miss Marple's fabricated tale of a hidden will had flushed Thorne out, his shadow in her garden proof of his greed. She devised a final move. She informed Dr. Haydock that another blackmail note had arrived, demanding a payment to be left in a hollow tree near the churchyard. With Dermot's help, she arranged for the police to watch the spot. That evening, under a sky pricked with stars, Thorne was caught retrieving a bundle of notes, his cigarette glowing like a beacon in the dark. Miss Marple, watching from the vicarage window with Mr. Clement, felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction as the true listener was unmasked. Thorne's arrest broke the spell over St. Mary Mead. He had preyed on the village's secrets, using Pym's zeal and Elsie's naivety to weave his net. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, reflected on the fragility of trust in a small community. The listener had been silenced, but she knew the villagers' whispers would never cease, waiting for another to exploit them. Chapter 11. The village restored. The autumn sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, as if the village itself exhaled in relief. The arrest of Mr. Thorne, unmasked as the true listener, had lifted the pall of fear that had settled over its lanes and hearths. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a cup of tea, watched the sparrows flit among the rose bushes, her knitting a soft accompaniment to the village's restored rhythm. The listener's web had been torn apart, and the threads of suspicion and dread were beginning to mend. In the days following Thorne's capture, the village pieced itself back together. Mr. Pym, chastened by his unwitting role, sought forgiveness. At the vicarage, his scholarly pride humbled. Reverend Clement, his kindly nature prevailing, offered absolution, and Pym, unable to bear the weight of his misstep, quietly packed his books and left for Oxford, vowing to bury himself in archives. Far from St. Mary Mead's gossip, Miss Marple, hearing of his departure, felt a pang of pity but no surprise. She had seen his type before, men whose ideals outstripped their judgment. Elsie, the maid, came to Miss Marple's cottage, her eyes red from tears but her shoulders lighter. Over a shared pot of tea, she confessed her part-passing tidbits to Pym for small payments, unaware of Thorne's darker scheme. The garnet brooch, she admitted, was Thorne's gift, slipped to her with a smile that masked his intent. "I thought it was just talk," she said, her voice small. Miss Marple, her tone as gentle as ever, advised discretion and offered a kind word, knowing Elsie's youth had been her only crime. The girl returned to Netherby Hall, her chatter subdued but her loyalty to Mrs. Bantry renewed. Miss Lavinia Gray, too, crept back to the village, her return marked by a quiet tea at the Blue Boar rather than the fanfare of her earlier days. Her reputation, bruised by the public confession, was slowly mending, aided by Mrs. Bantry's staunch defence and the village's short memory for scandal. Dr. Haydock, freed from the shadow of blackmail, resumed his rounds with a lighter step, his smile regaining its old warmth. The secrets Thorne had wielded were buried, their power broken by his exposure. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, reflected on the affair. She thought of a village scandal from her girlhood, when a postmistress eavesdropping had nearly ruined a family, undone only by a neighbour's quiet vigilance. Thorne had been cleverer, his Turkish cigarettes and forged references a mask, for his greed, but he had underestimated the power of observation. Miss Marple's trap, the false will, the note in the alms box had drawn him out, proving that even shadows could not hide from a keen eye. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber, Miss Marple set her cup down and picked up her knitting. St. Mary Mead was at peace, its secrets safe for now, but she knew the village's pulse would always carry whispers. She smiled faintly, her needles clicking, content to watch and listen, the guardian of truths too subtle for most to see. Chapter 12. The final stitched leaves of St. Mary Mead drifted earthward in a slow, golden dance, carpeting the lanes as autumn deepened. In her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, the glow casting soft shadows across her drawing room. Her knitting needles moved with their familiar rhythm, weaving the pale blue wool into a shawl now nearly complete. The village had settled into a fragile calm, the listener's rain of whispers silenced, yet Miss Marple's mind lingered on the case, tying its final knots. A letter from her nephew, Inspector Dermot Craddock, lay on the table, its contents confirming what she had pieced together. Thorne, under interrogation, had confessed fully, revealing a network of petty blackmailers he had hoped to join in London. He had seen St. Mary Mead as easy prey, its small secrets ripe for exploitation. His toolspim's misguided notes, Elsie's innocent gossip had been twisted to his purpose, but his greed had led him to Miss Marple's trap. Dermot's letter praised her instincts, though she smiled at his words. Knowing her methods were too quiet for official reports, the village, she mused, was like her knitting a pattern of simple stitches that could unravel if pulled too hard. Miss Grey's return, Dr. Haydock's restored confidence. Elsie's chastened silence, these were threads mended, but others would fray in time. She thought of a long-ago seamstress in her father's parish, whose whispered tales had stirred discord until a quiet word from Miss Marple's mother had stilled her tongue. St. Mary Mead would always hum with secrets, but it was her task, unspoken and unseen, to keep its fabric whole. She tucked Dermot's letter into a drawer, her fingers brushing the scrap of paper from Miss Grey's cottage. Now irrelevant, but kept as a reminder of how close the village had come to unraveling. Rising, she moved to her window, where the last light of day touched the church spire. The listener was gone, but others would come, less clever, perhaps, but no less dangerous. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the quiet lanes, seeing what others missed. Her needles resumed their work, each stitch a silent promise to guard St. Mary Mead's peace. One careful observation at a time. The end.